All right, we are here on episode 7 of The Modern Disciple. I'm Ryan Schneider.
I'm Chris Van Buren.
And we're joined again by...
Brady Collier.
Yeah, glad to have you back.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back. This is fun.
Yeah.
Enjoy it.
Well, we just enjoy your expertise on this show because, like our tagline says, we're not experts, but we hope to get the opinions of someone who is.
Yeah. Well, that's good because today... This is something that I kind of worked on, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and I've been living with some assumptions and wanted to see if that expertise you still think is accurate, because it's really kind of targeted to folks, technically all of our ages, but you probably fit the demo a little bit better than me at this point.
Yeah, so it's like a reverse episode. You're basically going to be kind of asking us questions.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like it. I like it.
Looking forward to that. Going to make me feel young on this episode, right?
Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh.
Well, why don't you just share what the topic is?
Yeah, sure. So what I've seen over the past 10, 15 years as I've been digging into a lot of ministry trends and things like that is a lot of attention focused on the millennial generation. And a reason for that focus is because that generation is huge. And technically, I've got some personal interest because I'm at the top end of that. Typically, the most demographers believe that this generation is from about 1980 to the year 2000. That would be born in 1980 to 2000. So roughly, early 20s to early 40s currently are those that fit this demographic, this generation. And, they just think about the world a little bit differently than other generations. Every subsequent generation thinks about things differently, but this one, it's unique in that it's quite large. And it is now just coming of age where all your young people that are coming into the workforce, the ones that are coming to the church, really fit this mold. And so if we're not cognizant of how we can best reach them or understand them, then I think there's going to be a big disconnect in our churches and really even our businesses and the world as a whole. So,
Yeah, no, and I think in your role as a pastor, I think it's great that you really have that awareness of the changing world that we live in. And I think it's even more, I guess, admirable that you talked about the importance of being able to reach those that group of people and understand them at their level. But like we talked about the last time you were here, not changing the truth.
Absolutely.
Right?
Definitely. So one of the interesting things about this generation is if you were to go back in history, what we find is the previous largest generation was the baby boomer generation. And it got its name because as GIs were coming back from World War II, they were coming back to their families and starting bigger families. And that happened all kind of in a boom period. So it was the baby boomer generation, and it was the largest generation in American history and affected so much of what happened in our culture, in our churches, in our businesses, just society as a whole. The generation that came after them, Generation X, actually tended to be a pretty small generation, respectively. But now, as the Gen Xers and some of the older boomers started having kids and those types of things, the millennial generation just kind of exploded. And actually, the last data that I saw, I think it was like 77.9 million Americans are millennials.
Wow.
And that's more than 2 million more than the baby boomer generation who previously changed everything. And so there's a lot of people, if we think that America is roughly 300 million people at any time, which is kind of the rough number, then we're looking at almost a third of our population fitting into this group. And so if we don't kind of pay attention to them, then we're almost just saying, hey, a third of the people in the world or our country, yeah, we're not going to do things your way. We're not really interested in that. Just kind of conform to us. And I don't think that's the wise approach.
Right, and I think you brought up the millennials are starting to enter the workforce, already have the church age that you would start attending a church. And I think you can see across America, just with the decline of churches, that maybe some churches haven't done a good job of keeping up with that millennial generation.
Sure. I would definitely affirm that. And alongside of that, you got to keep in mind whenever you've got this generation gap between boomers and millennials as these huge generations and then a smaller generation in between. Well, when you've got, because as millennials are coming into the workforce and the work age, the young adult age, guess what's happening to the previous largest generation? They're retiring and passing away and things like that. And so where historically in American history, you've always got this slightly larger generation that's going to step in. And so there's always this leadership platform just waiting next. Well, if you've got this huge generation that is all retiring, passing on, moving on, and then you've got a small generation of your, let's say, 40 to 60-year-olds, those that are typically the middle-aged folk that are stepping into these positions typically, there's not near enough of them to fill the shoes of the ex-going baby boomers. And so now you've got a lot of millennials who are younger than their predecessors have been, assuming roles that are much broader and larger than some of their predecessors have had. And so there's this almost leadership or just this people vacuum in ages. And if this younger generation doesn't get the opportunity to lead, then there's going to be a lot of gaps within our economy, within our churches, within our culture. And so we've seen even more so in recent years where this generation stepped up in leading huge, large companies. And so it's becoming more acceptable now than it was even 10 years ago. But there's still that element of what's going to happen as all the boomers retire, age out. There's got to be somebody that steps in.
Yeah. And based on what you're saying, I guess kind of what I'm hearing from a leadership standpoint is that like a lot of the millennials, because of the gaps that you were talking about, they're kind of missing out on being led in a sense, right?
Definitely.
Because there's, like you said, there's that smaller gap in between the baby boomers and the millennials,
right?
And so, they're kind of having to learn as they go while they're in the leadership role, right?
Yeah,
I think that's kind of like. It can be an intimidating spot to be in, especially like you said, if you're somebody that's leading a big corporation or maybe somebody that's leading a church in a sense too, right?
Yes, definitely,
man.
Yeah, and I like how you brought up culture. I mean, look at sports. All the new NFL coaches are getting younger.
Yeah,
and then look at the workforce. I mean, I hear all the time that we're going to have a big electrician shortage, a big plumber shortage, a big this shortage because that generation gap. So
yeah,
that's
you're
cool.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so I know this is a cool cultural topic, but we're talking about the church in particular because this is also an issue there. And so, like I mentioned, it's been some dated research, but the research, what I wanted to do from the research is more bring out concepts and ideas on ways to reach the millennials. And so anecdotally, I just have 5 things that I think are important if the church is going to reach this generation. So I just kind of want to share them with you and see if you agree, disagree, just get some raw opinions because y'all haven't heard this, right?
No.
Yeah, this is all fresh.
This is
right?
it.
First time go.
Excellent. All right. So one of the first things I think is important if we're going to reach this generation is we've got to be prepared to answer the why question. The reason I say that is because that hasn't always historically been the case within the church. There's been especially older generations have this idea of the authority, the older person says it, and so we just say, it's true. I know that growing up, the thing that I absolutely hated when my parents said more than anything else was because I said so.
Right.
You ever have that where, hey, why can't I go to that friend's house? And they just didn't want to deal with it. As a parent, I get that now. It's the easy response was like, because I said so.
Yep.
And all I wanted was an answer, this why. And this generation is all about that why. It's not so much that they want to be super divisive or think real weird or anything. They just want to know why we ought to believe the way that we're told to believe, why we ought to do the things that we're told to do, why the church is organized or operating in the way that it is. And if we can't answer those why questions, then they tend to push back and say, I don't understand. If we can't figure out the why, then why is it important? And so that's just one of those things that I've noticed and I know that I experienced. So what do y'all think about that?
Yeah, I think for millennials, that why question is so big because we do have access to those why questions for every other topic.
Yeah.
With the introduction of the internet, we can look up anything. We can look up, if you're watching a movie, why a director directed it that way.
Right.
And so we carry that on into every facet of our lives. And if the why doesn't make sense, then you're checking out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, really, when it comes to like you were saying, Brady, that because I said so answer. I know me as a millennial, or even when I was younger, like, so you're basically what you're telling me is to go draw my own conclusions, right?
Yeah,
Like you're because now in my head I'm like, okay, you said it's because you said so, but something in my brain is saying you have to have a why, and if you haven't given me one, now I have to go find my own in order for this to make sense in my head,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
and so like especially from a spiritual standpoint or where the church may be involved, and like you talked about, I mean, when you go searching for those whys, I mean, you don't really have a roadmap or a clear direction. You just kind of go to, I guess for me, I would take the path of least resistance, and that doesn't always get you to the truth,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do a lot in the messages that I preach is I may say the Bible says so, but that's totally different than because I say so, right?
Right.
And the reason that I feel comfortable doing that is because I've done the work of justifying and trusting in the Scripture. I've asked that same why question about the Bible and see that the way that it is written, the harmony, the unity, how it talks about things that then come true, and all of these different reasons. Because of that, I believe the Bible to be God's word. And if it's God's word, it's not Brady saying you ought to do this, but God saying it. And I may not understand all those things, but my why is because the Bible says so. And so, sure, sometimes I may not be able to give a precise answer on the very specific details of it. But if I can say, well, the Bible says so, that to me is a reason why, because I've worked back and saw that why come up over and over again. And
Right.
justification.
Yeah, it's just millennials won't blindly follow something.
No.
You know, and I think the more emotional, pick me up, motivational speeches may not be as effective as they were for other generations, because we're like, okay, we get that.
Yeah.
We get all that, but we want to know the details. You know,
Yeah.
we want to know the hard questions. And how do you feel like as a church you can do that? Is it on Sunday morning, or is it like a different specialized class?
So let's move to the next one. Let's hold
Got
that
it.
question
Hold that
because we're gonna get into that in just pretty much now. So
Okay.
the second thing that is unique to this millennial generation is that they desire to be relational, and that's not that other generations don't desire to be relational, but there's also just this level of privacy and distance that they tend to keep from others because there's an appearance that's kept up. This millennial generation, their primary driver is relationship. And so you just kind of mentioned this idea about those feel-good speeches and those, they may not work as well. Well, I would argue that the reason they don't work as well is because the previous generations, they tended to divorce the message that was being delivered from the person that was delivering it. It was a good message. Great, I can take that and do it. Whereas this generation, they're like, I'm not going to believe the words you say unless I can trust you as a person. If you as a person is actually living that out yourself. The absolute worst thing for them is to hear somebody say all these great things, but then go home and see them out and say, oh, that's not what that person looks, sounds, acts like on Sunday morning the rest of the week. And one of the most dangerous places this has occurred was within their own families. Historically, their families have gone and that other generation has bought into the message, and they would proudly affirm it and declare it with their words, but the kids would not see the parents do it with their actions throughout the rest of the week. And so there's this relational barrier where, okay, I know what I ought to think and believe, but I've never seen anyone actually live like that. And so is living like that really what's expected? Should I, or why should I not live in a way that's more reflective of how I actually think? And so maybe I need to think a little bit differently. And so the way to kind of bridge that is to build relationships in, so you can see and ask those hard questions and deal with other people on a real basis. One of the things that is important for me is to find ways for move the church from rows to circles. What I mean by that is in a row, you're there and you're watching someone else listening to something else, a Sunday morning message. I think that that's absolutely necessary. It's biblical. We do that kind of thing. But if that's the only spiritual engagement you get, then you're missing out on so much, because where real connection happen is in the circles where, like us, we're sitting here looking each other in the eye. We know about each other's lives. We're talking about more than just what's the topic at hand today, but we know that you've got kids, you're a father, all of these types of things. And that is absolutely important for this generation. Other generations could go to church and be perfectly content, not really knowing anyone and being perfectly fine, getting a good message and doing it all on their own. Well, this group, they need those people in the trenches with them that know they've got their back and are actually not only believing the same thing, but are living the same thing you are. And that encouragement really helps.
Yeah, I think you can see that at our home group that we do it here at my house. I mean, we have 15 people average. We've gotten up to 20. And I'd say out of all those people, the number of people who consistently go to church is like 4 on a Sunday. And it's because, like, I think that's an accurate assumption that we crave the fellowship and the relationship more than the pulpit, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I mean, from my own experience, I know that being somebody who's living in this generation, it's important for me to also know that you and I may be dealing with the same struggles as well. And so, like, for example, like you can give a sermon on a Sunday morning, and then like we get together on a Tuesday, right, and we're sitting here talking. And, you know, like you said, like it's not me sitting in a row looking up at Pastor Brady preach, but it's me sitting here with Brady and we're having a conversation based on just everyday life.
Yeah.
And so that relational piece, I think, is important for especially millennials who have those questions about the whys, or maybe they have those struggles that they deal with. And if they just look at somebody preach on a Sunday morning, but don't have it in their mind that, hey, maybe that person is struggling with what I'm struggling with, or they have in the past. And you know what I mean?
Right.
Like that relational part, I think, really plays big into the I guess the sins that we all struggle with. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think you can look at cancel culture when you talk about millennials needing to know that the person they're listening to is true. You know, they're not just going to take the words you say and move along. They need to know that you're real. Look at cancel culture. I mean, and that's led by the millennial generation, right?
Yeah, primarily.
Where it's like, if you mess up, I'm not going to watch any of the movies you're in. I'm not going to listen to anything you've made, like if you're a songwriter, anything. And you can bet that that's to the utmost importance when it comes to spirituality. It's even more important than movies or music. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, definitely. So here is one of the actual stats that was found whenever I originally did this research. So this would have been kind of right when the millennial generation was coming of age. They were still, the oldest ones were in their mid to low 20s, just entering the workforce. And it was an open-ended question that was asked of them that was, what is really important in your life? And they could pick from anything, whether it be work or money or travel or nice house, where they live, anything at all. 61% of millennials said that family was what was important to them. The second thing at 25% was friends. So right there alone, you're looking at 86% of the responses were either family or friends.
Wow.
Nothing else even had upwards of 17% affirmation. So all those other things that have motivated other generations, the money, the corporate ladder, those, it's just not the same with the millennials. And I think anecdotally, we see that all the time where people are taking less money to be at other places.
Work from home.
Yeah, work-life balance, like all those things. That's a uniquely millennial thing, and it plays out in our churches as well that we've got to be aware of.
Wow, that's yeah. I mean, and I would agree to that. I would answer that the same way. You know, I was never asked that question. Right.
Yeah.
I wish I was.
Uh-huh.
I'd like to be part of that. But no, I definitely agree with that piece because when somebody asked, what was the question exactly again? It was
what do you find important in your life? What's really important in your life?
Yeah. So, and I think that word really is something that can be easily looked over. But if you add that word into that question, now I'm forced to think, and then now I'm thinking, okay, well, what gives me like now I'm not thinking of just the physical thing, like the physical things that give me make me feel good or whatever the case, but like what truly makes me feel good inside.
Right.
And then I start thinking about the people in my life that when I'm around them, because the physical objects in my life, I know that, it's there and then it's gone, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't really get that same feeling. And so I know that relationship aspect of Christianity as well. And wanting to understand the relational aspect of my of how I connect with God.
Right.
And I don't know if that's something that's extremely popular in the millennial culture. I mean, you might get to that, but that relationship with the Lord, I know that's something that I've heard a lot lately, but in the past it may not have been as popular. The whole it's a relationship, not a religion.
Right. Yeah,
That's
definitely.
that's been a big thing that I know has been talked about a lot.
Right. Yes. And that kind of plays in here just a second as well.
I knew it was coming.
Yeah. So let's just, unless you got something else, I'll move on to the third one, which kind of comes out of that. We talk about this idea of relationship, and one of the things is that we want to know the person that's talking to us and see. So the next one makes that a little bit more explicit, is that the millennial generation, they want transparency. Means that if they are giving to a cause, they want to know where those monies go, not just some nebulous thing. If you are saying that something is important, the kind of the why, but all the background behind it is like, okay, let me see, let's show our work type thing. In the past, it's been real easy. I know this analogy works with my son because he's really into this. He loves to do math in his head. And so one of the things he goes round and round with the teachers, he was in 4th grade this past year, is having to show his work, having to write all the steps. It's like, why? It gets to the same point. It's like, yeah, but the teacher wants to see how you got there. I think this millennial generation is one that wants to see how we get there. It doesn't matter. We can trust someone all day long, and we may even believe and go along with their conclusions and what we ought to do, but we want to see the work so that we know that they're not trying to pull one over on us.
Yeah.
It's just this whole trust issue and this relation issue, because for years we've seen people that say one thing and do something else. And so this transparency is just really important if we're going to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think, we've seen some of the transgressions where people have been tight with or secretive with their money. So now we're like, hey, we want to know where it's going.
Yeah.
And you can even look at economics as a whole. What's it called? Ergonomics, the new kind of wave of companies, going green, donating.
Right.
That's more important to millennials than a flashy commercial,
Right.
or sometimes even a price.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people, I'll go with the Green Mountain Energy instead of some other energy company, because I want to know, and millennials want to know, that what they're donating to, what they're purchasing, what they're feeding their money into is being used for a good cause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about the whole trust factor, and I'm not sure where does that exactly come from? Is because I know you briefly spoke on it about like things in the past, but like why does that fit into the millennial generation as opposed to the what was the middle one?
The Gen X.
Yeah. Like why does it fit more into the millennials?
Yeah,
Why would
I
you
think there's definitely a possibility that the Gen Xers kind of fill these. And I wouldn't say that all of these are exclusive to the millennial generation. Just it's really come to a head because of a number of millennials and how it has radically changed the culture of business, of church, the world, all those types of things. Gen X, they could agree with every one of these things. Just in sheer numbers, they weren't enough to move the needle, if you will.
Gotcha.
And that's not a negative or anything. It's just the facts of how many people we're talking about. influencing culture at once and things like that.
Well, I mean, you can look at the demographics of the people who follow some of these, like TV preachers, where you call in and give them money. I would assume, right or wrong, whatever they are. I'm not going to get into that, but I assume that it's like upwards of 90% over Gen X, like Gen X and baby boomer, because I don't know what it is, but for a millennial, it's like, I'm not doing that. I need to see where my money's going, man.
Yeah. And to that end, historically, especially with the boomer and older generations, authority was a big thing. And I'm not saying it in a negative way. It was just the pastor automatically had respect. If he got in the pulpit and said something, 90% of the people are going to believe it without fact checking or anything, just because that's who he was. I would be willing to bet that I wasn't here at this time, but if you go look throughout history with your president, even if you didn't vote for him, if they said something from the platform, there's a lot more agreement and we want to do what's best for the country. And if he's the person leading us, then, hey, I may not have voted for him, but I'm at least going to respect him and do that kind of thing. I don't see that in
how that has changed
today.
Chris can't say anything because he's still active.
Let's
change topics.
Change subject quickly. But so maybe that's where we all need to be. If we're just all active, then we can all just
move past it.
Move past it. There we go. But there was just certain professions and certain people that just because they held that role, they de facto were believed. I think even in the households, grandparents for a long time were that. Dads for a long time were that. And now as culture continues to shift, then there's a lot more of like, I want to believe that person, but I don't know that I have the reason to. And so transparency allows some of that showing your work and why you get to the same conclusions.
And when you say transparency, are you talking about in the way like a person lives their life or in the way they deliver a message? I mean, I know those they can be transparent in both of those ways, but if we're talking, if I'm talking to somebody who like, a millennial who wants to be a Christian or whatever the case may be, like, and if transparency is important in that relationship, is it more in the way I, like I said, live my life before and after that conversation, or the transparency like in the middle?
So the easiest way for me to kind of describe transparency is just telling the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, right? And so we're not trying to hide anything. It's just, hey, here's what I'm saying. Here's what I believe. Here's my work. And so a lot of times this transparency thing comes from more of an organizational level. Like there is some elements to it as a one-on-one, but what we talk about there typically is what I'm going to get to next. But from organizational level, there's just this transparency that we've got to be willing to talk about the hard things and show our cards instead of, hiding things and keeping them out and like, ooh, that could cause controversy. So let's just not say anything at all. Let's just pretend like everybody's happy and all those things, where sometimes we just have to say, you know what, this happened. It's not fun. I wish it didn't, but let's be open and honest about it.
Yeah, so I like that. And especially in today's age where controversy is just all over the place, right? I think you talking about transparency is so huge because understanding is on the other side of that. So like I can be transparent with somebody and I would hope that they're transparent with me. But we also have to have understanding on both sides so that we can have a conversation, especially when it comes to spirituality and Christianity or whatever it is that we're talking about, that transparency and understanding on both sides. Like I want your transparency so that I can try to understand you. And I guess that builds in with the relationship aspect. So when I understand you, now we have a relationship and it's a healthy one.
Right.
You know?
Like you need to have your cards on the table.
Yeah. So you'll notice that all these kind of build on each other, but kind of approaching it from different ways because the millennial mind is kind of oriented in this direction. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the fourth one, and it's authenticity, that we've got to be authentic. And so if transparency is kind of showing our work, authenticity is pointing out, you know what, here's why I missed that problem. It's being able to admit that we're not perfect and that sometimes our decisions are wrong. Right. And so I see this is organizationally, absolutely, but you even get more of that interpersonal thing here. When we're sharing with people that, hey, Christ has changed my life and all these things, but we also say, you know what, but I'm not perfect. There's still times that I get angry at my wife. I think she shouldn't do this. Is that what the Bible says to do? No. And I'm working on it, but I know it's better when I obey the Bible than when I don't. And so we can still be willing to admit our sin and admit that we mess up. We've got sin patterns and things in our own lives. And so I hope that you still follow me in spite of these.
Yeah.
Historically, the older generations, and it's even been taught, I've heard it from some of the people that were teaching me in seminary and things, is when you've got a personal issue, you make sure you steer clear of that in your messages and the way that you talk to people, because you don't want people to lose respect for the pastor or think that, oh man. And so it will actually affect their spirituality if they know that you struggle with sin. This generation is not like that.
Yeah.
They're like, that guy is a phony if he can really get up there and make us think that he doesn't struggle with anything and he's got no problems, because that's not life. That's not what Scripture says life is, right? And so it's difficult when you're leading a multi-generational church, because there's this one group that thinks you ought not to ever say anything bad about yourself, and there's this other group that's thinking, hey, if I'm going to buy in and trust this guy, I have to see that he's a real person like me. And those interests aren't always, they're sometimes competing. And part of being authentic is being okay with people having a different view of you when they know the real you. And personally, that's the easiest way for me to live, is because I can constantly try to paint this life of who I would like to be. But that's a house of cards that eventually falls, because eventually who you really are shines through, right? And so for me, it's important to talk about those flaws and everything from the pulpit or in conversations with people, because I'm not naive enough to think that you think that I'm perfect, right?
Right.
And the millennials are just willing to vocalize that. And so if we can get ahead of the game and be authentic with them, it makes a big difference in engaging that group of people.
Man, I love that piece, because I didn't think that's where you were going with authenticity.
Yeah.
But, well, first off, anybody watching, right? I think that there's a time and place. You shouldn't just go up to somebody, hey, I'm a Christian and these are all my sins.
Sure.
Right?
Definitely.
No, I mean, but at the end of the day, what I will say is that something that has really been a blessing in my life is being authentic in the way you just described it. Because now when I have conversations with people, and especially if we're talking about God and how he's worked in my life, and the Lord presents an opportunity for me to be authentic, I find that, one, I'm no longer like, there's like a weight lifted off my shoulders, because now I've just laid everything out to you about sins that I've struggled with, and I, you know what I mean? Like there's nothing like inside of me that's like, oh, I hope they don't find it out. I just told you, you know what I mean?
Right.
But at the same time, I also, for me personally, I don't look at it as, I hope that you don't look at me a different way. The reason being is because I know where I'm at with Christ.
Right.
And so I know that I am a sinful human being. I know that sin that I just told you about won't be my only one, won't be my last one, you know. But I know that I'm in a growing relationship with the Lord. And so really, ultimately what matters is that relationship. However, I still want to have a healthy relationship with people that I come in, you know what I mean? So I kind of when I prioritize it that way, then I'm more open to share and be authentic. And also the other way that it's helped me in my life is sharing that with somebody who didn't even know, or who may have been struggling with that sin, or is struggling with that sin at that point in time. And now we can talk about how the Lord helped me through it, and hopefully it'll bless you in that way.
Right.
You know? So that's it's been a blessing, that authenticity.
So going back to one of your previous kind of questions that we were talking about, this idea of religion versus relationship and how it seems like it plays more and more. And I would actually say that these things of transparency and authenticity play right into that, right? Because if you see Christianity as a list of check boxes, go to church on Sunday, attend Sunday school, be there Wednesday night, give 10%, do this, do that, you can go through and actually check every box. It's possible. And if you are thinking that the relationship with Christ is merely a list of check boxes, well, authentically, I don't have to talk about my dirty stuff because look, I'm a good Christian because I checked all the boxes. Right. What's happening on in your heart and everything, those don't matter because it's not about a relationship. It's about checking things. But as we talk about this thing with being a relationship, it totally changes the picture. With me and Vanessa, if there was just a checklist of things that she says, all right, I need this done, this done, and this done, I can be a perfect husband for the day, right? But we know that it's not just that list of check boxes. There's emotions involved. There's dealing with kids. There's things that pop up and all these. And so our relationship, I think it's very healthy and, would do anything for her. But there's still times that she gets frustrated with me and I get frustrated with her. And it's simply because part of that relationship is a living, breathing thing, and we're both fallen human creatures. There's going to be times where there's a little bit of tension. And so we as human beings that are still not yet fully restored in the image of Christ, we're going to have things in us that occasionally cause us to displease God, to be far from God, to do those. And if we're not willing to at least admit that and share with others when that happens in a way that's encouraging, then I think that weakens our ability to have influence on others with their spiritual lives as well.
Yeah, and I think that's another big point because it seems to me like this might be more than just millennials, but when you put yourself out there as a Christian, there's like a predeposition from an outsider looking in. And for some people, not everyone, it goes like, oh, look at him. He thinks he's so perfect.
Right.
And I feel like part of the authenticity is showing them that you're not perfect.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I don't think I'm perfect.
Right.
I'm trying my best, but there are still many things that I struggle with daily. And it might not be visible to the outside.
Right.
You know what I mean? As a lot of issues really aren't. But authenticity is a huge thing.
So I behind the scenes, just a little bit, my thought process in this is because I think our last podcast, you kind of mentioned how, the churches you grew up in, the Baptist churches, it would be surprising to ever see a pastor without suit and tie on Sunday morning and those types of things, right?
Yeah.
And the mentality behind it is dress your best for God. And that's an idea that I can get behind. And in fact, that was what I was taught. And I struggled through college. Like all the other college kids were just wearing jeans. I was like, I'm at least going to put on a pair of khakis. Like that's at least something, because that was kind of taught from our platform, but they wanted to reach the college kids. And so they didn't, but anyway. And that's how I was, for as long as I could remember, until I started getting into the scriptures and saw the Apostle Paul. And as he was building these churches, one thing that I never saw was Paul putting on special clothes to go reach these people. Instead, he was taking his regular tunic, his authentic self, and engaging them where they're at. And they would start these churches not with certain clothes or anything, but they would start with what they wore throughout the day. And so for me, and again, this is a me thing and my rationale, not trying to push it on anybody else, but for me, it became an authenticity issue that if on Sunday morning I dressed up in a suit and tie, you will not find me wearing those clothes any other time. That's inauthentic to me.
Right.
And so I wear something much more accustomed to what I would wear on a normal basis, where if you saw me out at a dinner with my wife, you'd probably see something very similar. Why? Because that is the real me. It's not putting on a show. And I just felt, for me personally, that if I dress up in a way that isn't really me, then I'm trying to present an image to people that come in that I'm really not.
Right.
And that bothered me. And I felt like there would even be a disconnect there with some of that. So,
man. And I mean, on the topic of authenticity and you were talking about checking the blocks, I think that another way to really look at it is if for whatever reason you look at Christianity or your relationship with Jesus as checking the blocks, you don't leave room for growth. And I think that that's the important piece of being authentic and understanding that we've all fallen short it lets us know that there's always room for growth.
Right.
And then we talked about how, or really I always mention the fact that every day is its own journey, right? Like every day that we wake up is its own journey. Every day you have an opportunity to grow because every day you have fallen short.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so that's why I think being comfortable with being authentic. Now, I guess that's a question for you for a lot of millennials or for someone who struggles with or who may struggle with being comfortable. Like they know, all right, I need to be authentic. Maybe they have these conversations where they have an opportunity to do it, but they're just not comfortable. How do you get comfortable with being authentic?
Yeah, I think that ultimately you've got to be able to get to a place with your relationship with God that you're okay if the person across the table from you rejects you from it. Because as humans, a lot of people are looking for reasons to not like someone. I mean, if you just look at I hate to go back to politics, but I mean, we're a divided country right now, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's you name it, there's two sides and they want to yell and argue with each other.
Right.
And so when you're being authentic, you've got to be so okay with your relationship and standing before the Lord that you're willing to lose that other person because there's a chance that'll happen. And I think it's worthwhile because one, if we're doing what the Holy Spirit's prompting us, we ought to be, listening to the Spirit and being able to live out of the Spirit anyway. And if we're doing that, then even if we're rejected, we're still being obedient. And so it's a good thing. But also will be surprising at how often other people are just sitting on things because they're not comfortable in their own skin and they're not comfortable with that relationship with God. And they are not comfortable being vulnerable enough to share the things that they're going on with. But when somebody else has the maturity to do that, then all of a sudden, the guards are down and they're willing to engage and let you know what kind of stuff's really going on with them as well. I think that authenticity is a necessity if you're going to move that relationship between just a surface level relationship and a genuine full-on relationship that is meaningful to both parties.
Powerful.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. I was going to say something. We'll have to edit this. I was going to say something. Man, I forgot. It was on the... I forgot. You got it.
I'm ready. That's
good.
That
was huge. That was great.
All right.
I was going to say something, man. All right. I'll think about it next time. It's in here. That's what matters.
Hey, we still got a few more minutes. Like I still got my last one, right?
Yeah.
And so it's all coming together, and it all, like I said, feeds off each other. And this fifth one is we've got to be prepared to enter into dialogue, not monologue. The idea behind this, quite simply, being for years and years and years, most of information dissemination has come from a monologue standpoint. I don't know if things started changing a little bit by the time y'all started getting through high school and college, but at least me as an older millennial and everyone that I've known before that, the vast majority of teaching was, they call it stand and deliver, I think, which is where somebody stands at the front of the room and gives you information and you better figure out a way to soak it in.
Yeah.
And it goes through the education system. It went through the churches, went into even small groups. Many of them were, okay, I'm going to now give a lesson. You be quiet until I ask for your participation so as not to disrupt me and those types of things. Those are monologues. That's talking at someone. This millennial generation, they don't learn like that. They don't engage like that. They want to be able to ask questions in the moment and dialogue. Now, you probably are wondering, okay, well, how do you do that from the platform, from the pulpit? And it's hard. And so if you've noticed, if you listen to me, I sometimes have to play the role of the other person. And so many of my messages throughout, I'm asking questions. Say, hey, you may be wondering, or if you even look at the notes, the first one is a question and then provide some answers to it. Try to simulate that dialogue even in my conversation, because I know how important it is to them. And another thing that's very important to me is making myself available afterwards or provide contact information, because I want people to know that if there's something in there that, hey, what do you really mean by that? Or that didn't sit right, that you can actually reach out and ask those questions. I don't ever want it to be a point where, all right, here is the information, take it, believe it, deal with it, and just figure it out yourselves. Like, dialogue is so vital for this group of people to engage in anything they do. And so I think it's just important that we intentionally make paths for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I hear a bunch of people say is like, I'm tired of being talked at my whole life, from the time I was born up until now. And that's why when we were constructing like our home group, me and Ashley were like, do we want to do like a teak? Like, do we want to do a lesson? Do we want to just watch a video? And then we were like, you know what, let's just read and have nothing.
Yeah.
And let's just have a dialogue about whatever pops into your head, because that is what resonates the most with millennials.
Yeah. That's why I love this format of coming and having conversations with you, because it'd be real easy for me to just record, my thoughts in a 30-minute block and send it out and say, hey, Ryan, would you edit this for me? And like that. But having a conversation allows, that those thoughts to be stimulated and the opportunity for differing ideas and opinions to even enter in the conversation and process them in real time. So
yeah. So let me ask you, since we're on the topic of dialogue, how would you explain it to maybe a millennial in prayer, right? Because whenever you first brought it up, I thought about how a lot of times people's past experience of Christ and God and prayer is, God says this and you do it, right? Which I guess that's not necessarily my question. My question is why I just wanted you to speak on the importance of when you are praying and your relationship with God and your dialogue with God isn't just you talking at God, right? But like, how important is you having that openness to receive from Him, and what does that look like, or what does that look like for somebody who is like, hey, how do I have that dialogue, and how do I receive it from God?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that if we're being honest with ourselves, we live in a very noisy world, right? And so I think a lot of times that we struggle having dialogue with God is because we're scared to sit in silence. We need noise around us. And if we're sitting there and we make a petition, ask something, and within like 2 seconds, something doesn't happen, we're like, all right, I better say something else or move along. It even happens in conversations. Have you noticed how awkward it is just to sit in silence? Like, this is one of the things that I picked up as I became better at teaching throughout the years. Because, preaching isn't the only thing that I've done. In fact, I did far more of small group and that kind of teaching before. And this dialogue portion was always very important to me, because that's where the best stuff really comes out. And one of the things that I would always go into a room with people, especially when they were new, is say, I'm not afraid of silence, because a lot of them are. And so you ask a question and it's crickets, and the natural instinct is, all right, I've got to fill the silence. And so I just sit there and look at them, and it would get real awkward. When you sit about 30 seconds in a room where a question's been asked and everybody's just like, people start to get antsy and finally start saying something.
Yeah.
I think that one of the reasons that we have a hard time hearing from God in this dialogue is simply because we get antsy and we have a hard time sitting in silence and just allowing ourselves the space and clear heads and clear minds to allow Him to engage us in that conversation.
Man, that's powerful. So I guess for anybody watching, and if you want to talk from like maybe something that you do or something that you would recommend, like, would you say, hey, get up early and go in a closet, or a quiet room in your house, or how would you do that, like in the middle of a work day? Like, what does that kind of look like?
I think it's really dependent on each person. Just as my relationship with Vanessa looks different than your relationship with Maddie or your relationship with Ashley. Each of our relationships with God looks a little bit different. And I think one of the disservices the church has done historically is says, this is what a relationship with God looks like. Like, well, I mean, why? If God created each and every person with our unique personalities and our unique roles, do we not think that he knows who we are and knows how best to interact with him? And so I feel like often whenever we try to put ourselves in just this, again, checking the boxes of what prayer looks like, about what reading the Bible, like all these types of things, we don't allow our personalities that God has put in us and God knows directly about them to really live out in the relationship with them. My relationship with Vanessa works best whenever I can be my authentic self, who I've been created to be, because that makes me the best husband, right? Same thing with her. Whenever I find ways to honor her and lift her up and lean into the things that God has naturally made her, that's when she's the best wife. We've got 3 kids. I know y'all are parents, still pretty little and don't have multiples. And so as someone who's a little bit further in the road, my 3 kids all have very different personalities. I'm the same person, right? I'm the same dad, but the way I engage and interact with them is different because I know who they are. I know what they like, what they dislike. I know how I can get a response with some that I can't with the others. And I truly believe that God's the same way. He's not just saying, all right, I'm up here, here I am. You need to do it this way, check the box. And that's how our relationship flourishes. It's like, no, I know you. I knit you in the womb before you were even thought of by your parents. I know who you are. I know how I made you. Lean into that. And through that personality I've given you, I'm asking you now express it back to me. And so that's a long roundabout way of saying, if you're a morning person, then yeah, maybe waking up early and getting alone is a great way. If you're a person that just thrives on energy and maybe you're an extrovert and you need people around, maybe getting in a quiet closet in the best place, maybe it's going to the coffee shop, putting on some headphones and just having that energy around you, but you can tune out that energy and still have that dialogue with God. For others, if you're a night owl, maybe it's getting around with your family and it's a communal relationship that, I mean, I still think you need some personal, but maybe primarily your family as a whole. Like, again, it really depends a lot on who God has made you to be and what your best self is. One of the things that I've been learning about myself over the past several years is even within my work, there are certain hours that I'm better than others. Like there's just peak hours that I'm most aware. There's certain environments, like natural light's a big thing to me. I'm going to work better if I've got natural light versus just a sterile, artificial light type scenario. And I think that as people are figuring these things out about their best way to work professionally, that we ought to think that if it affects our attitude and our modes and our productivity professionally, why would we not think it also affects the way that we can engage and worship God? And so I would encourage everybody to figure out who you are, figure out what environments evoke certain things, and play around with it until you get your rhythm of how you best engage God.
That was great.
Another good answer.
Yeah, that was excellent.
It's almost like he's a pastor or something.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, I like that idea of fine-tuning what your relationship looks like with God. I might have to try out that coffee shop one.
Yeah.
Because I am a person who thrives
Right.
on energy.
Right.
So when I sit down and I'm like, this room is so quiet.
Well, see, and the complete opposite is if I go to, as soon as I step foot in a coffee shop, I'm just like stress level, anxiety level, overload. I was like, there's a bunch of people, they're making things that I don't understand what they're talking about. Like all of that. I was like, I would want to be anywhere else but in here. But,
Right.
You know, that's why I know that people are different.
Yeah. I think it's so cool too that because everybody can, especially after listening to your answer, can kind of determine what looks best for them.
Yeah.
And I think that at least for me as well, it's so cool to have that realization that whenever I look at that piece of my life where I'm my best self, and then telling myself, hey, like, let me put God in the middle of that, right? Because maybe that's something that a lot of people haven't been doing until hearing your answer, right? Because maybe because they've been trying to model their dialogue with God off of somebody else. Like, oh, they said I should, do this right before I go to bed or first thing in the morning. And then we forget about all those other times throughout the day when we are our best self.
Right.
And so I think that's why I said that I really loved your answer, because like hearing your answer is telling me, and I'm sure a lot of others, is to fit God into those times of the day that that you are your best self, because you just feel like there's something that you feel with that natural light that you were talking about, and that's probably God saying, hey, like, I want to talk to you here.
Yeah, I completely agree. A couple of clarifying points that I want to make sure that I'm articulate with. First is, want to make sure that when we're talking about, being our best self and everybody has a unique relationship with God, that God isn't changing. Like, he's not different, right? We are all created different, but we are all yet still in his image. And so I don't want us to think that whenever we're talking about these things, we start to conform God to a perception that we have of him and start to define, no, okay, now, Chris, your God may act like this, but my God doesn't. Like, no. There's one God completely independent of us.
Right.
But the way we relate to him, we've got a part in that. Just like the analogy with my kids, I'm one father, I'm one person. I don't change, but the way I interact with my kids does, based upon who they are and those types of things. And so with that being said, we see real clearly Scripture is God's overt communication to us all. And so I firmly believe that in a still small voice, he's never going to contradict his word, because God is unchanging and he's all true. And so if we get something within us and we think that it is, oh man, God's telling me to do that, but then we go look in our Bibles and the Bible says, that's not what I'm telling you to do. We don't trust that still small voice, because we realize that we're still fallen creatures and the Bible has the final word. But I firmly believe that in our dialogue with God, when he tells us something, and maybe it's something that, man, motivates us and is powerful, and maybe it's a stretch for us, I believe that he's going to reaffirm those same things with scriptures. And so that's why it's so important for us to stay in the word regularly and stay in prayer regularly. Which leads to kind of the second clarification that I want. Typically, when we hear these examples, hey, you need to be doing it first thing in the morning, or hey, you need to do it, we hear that from people who have figured out their rhythm. For them, that's where God has spoken clearly. That's how it works for them. That's where they do it. And so my advice is, if we think that we may be similar to that author or to that speaker or something like that, give it a shot. Because it won't hurt anything. But don't get so narrow focused that we think that it's got to be like that. But we know that it has worked for some in the past, and so maybe it will work for you. And so that's kind of my admonition there, is that we don't want to just kind of denounce that, oh, none of those, because it is good points and good value. Just make sure it's works for us in the way that God's created us. So
yeah, I fully resonate with your first clarification of the relationship with God looking, or when you're from two different cultures, right? Like you bringing that up just made me think of how, I was speaking with a buddy of mine who still lives in, or who lives in Chicago, right, in the neighborhood that we grew up in, and then we were speaking. And I live in Taylor, Texas, which is a completely different completely different demographic of people, completely different neighborhood. However, we can still have a conversation about an unchanging God, like you talked about, and that, like you said, is huge. And also, at least for me, I know that dialogue with God, it happens at the most. It just, for me, it happens at the most random times a day. Yeah. So what I mean by that is I'll just pray in my head while I'm sitting at my computer doing work, or while I'm driving, sitting in traffic. You know what I mean? So like dialogue with God, for me, is there's no set times. There's no which but also like you talked about with the whole people finding their rhythm, like I can still have a rhythm in between that, but also I'm still aware of the fact that like I can talk to God at any point in time. He's always there to listen.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And again, if we think about it like our spouses, there's throughout the day, we send each other text messages. Sometimes we need a phone call because there's something a little bit more in depth. Often we'll go home at night and kind of debrief, right after both of us get home from work, kind of go in our room, shut the door, and just, hey, how was your day type thing. And so we've got some natural rhythms that we've built. And I would imagine both of you have some rhythms that you built.
Right.
And I think it's similar with God that, yeah, there's some natural times that may be more extended conversation. And there's times that are like, hey, quick text messages, hey, while I'm thinking about it, help me, whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in traffic.
Yeah.
Give me grace and patience.
Give me patience, Lord.
Definitely.
Oh, man.
Well, awesome. Well, I hope we answered all your questions.
Yeah, it was great. I appreciate it. I felt like I did a lot more of the talking than I was wanting to, but hey, that's all right. Hey, before we go though, again, just kind of trying to put a bow on some of this, that why question, and we talked about it at the very beginning about the largeness of this generation, but bringing it down from like, okay, because we talked a lot about the church, but it was also a lot about just culture at large and how this millennial generation, all of these things I think necessarily apply to the church, but just being a good business person or community person, you need to hear these same things. But as we wrap up, I want to talk about why it's so vital the church buys in and doesn't just outsource all of this to the world and say, hey, you figure out how to deal with them, and then we'll just kind of, take your leftovers. As part of the research, there were questions about the millennials and their faith status. And some of this is just fascinating to me. The first question was, do you attend church at least once a month? The percentage of millennials that would affirm that they attend church once a month is 20%. So 1 in 5 of this nearly 80 million people goes once a month. But then it goes even further. It says only 15% of them would say that they are born again Christians, meaning that they actually have that relationship with God, that there's something else there. But then it even gets more scary because they asked them a list. There was a list of 7 statements asking them to affirm. And these are all pretty basic. I would think that most of our listeners would have no problem affirming these. This is just kind of the bare bones of what it means to be more of the conservative style of Christian. Here's the questions. It is, 1, the Bible is accurate written word of God. 2, I personally have the responsibility to tell others about my faith. 3, religious faith is important to me. 4, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and rules the universe. 5, salvation is available through grace alone, not by works. 6, Jesus never committed a sin on earth. And 7, Satan is a real living being and not just a symbol of evil. So those are all pretty basic things that we would believe, right?
Right.
Only 6% of the generation would be able to affirm those 7 statements.
Oh, wow.
And so when you're talking about 80 million people and only 6% of them saying those types of things, there's a lot and lot of the world, a lot and lot of people in our country who are far from God. And if we want to see God make a radical impact in this world, then we have to be aware of who we're talking to. Getting back into that contextualization conversation, broad strokes, one of our primary contextualization folks that we ought to be engaging are the millennials. And right now they're far from God. And so if we're not prepared to have dialogue with them, be authentic with them, do these things, then we're never going to be able to show them the importance of not only that relationship with Jesus, but what that actually entails and what that means. And so I just want to kind of leave it with that, just encouraging why this conversation is important and how we can hopefully do our parts in bringing others in this generation to Christ.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on because at the end of the day, it is our part.
Yeah.
We are the hands and feet of God.
Right.
We can't just pray that they get saved.
Yeah.
It's up to God, but
Yes.
it's up to us to carry that out.
Right. So God does the saving, but he's chosen us as his messengers. And so he empowers us to go out with his message and says, hey, all you need to do is deliver the message. I'll take it from there. But if we're not delivering the message, then we're not doing our part in this that God's handed over to us. And so,
Man, part of that daily prayer, or at least my daily prayer is, Lord, how do you want to use me today?
yeah.
And so, yeah, like Ryan said, I think that's a great point to end on.
Yeah. Well, Brady, thanks for coming on
Excellent.
again.
Yeah. Fun. Love it.
Yeah.
So,
We'll probably have you on again next month.
excellent. Sounds
Yeah.
great.
I'll let
Yeah.
you know what time.
All right. Perfect. That's great.
Perfect. This was great.
Well, awesome. Well, we'll see y'all next time.